We are live, we are recording. Good evening from the Judean Mountains, everybody. This is Jonathan Feldstein with another really apropos and I believe in what will be an informative Inspiration from Zion program. Sorry, I'm multitasking, trying to also follow everybody who's watching on Facebook. For those of you who are relatively new, who may not have been on a program like this before, Inspiration from Zion is a project of the Genesis 123 Foundation, of which I have the privilege of serving as president. And we have a really lovely and important overall mission to build bridges between Jews and Christians with Israel in ways that are new and unique and meaningful. I invite everybody to go to our website, genesis123.co, to see about some of the projects that we are doing, that we have aspirations to do, and certainly feel free to join us. I just will highlight 3 of them really quickly that you should be aware of. Hopefully we'll be able to revive those that involve people traveling to Israel in person. But Run for Zion as the first program focused around the Jerusalem Marathon, expressly for Christians as a Christian experience, which is a tremendous success. Verses for Zion as a program for Christian children to study biblical verses about Israel that relate to Israel and infuse them with a love and understanding of the centrality of Israel in their lives through those biblical verses. And we've had the really great privilege of hosting a series of programs called the Global Prayer for Israel, which has gone all over the world and been quite tremendous. All of these programs, by the way, are available on the Genesis 123 Foundation YouTube channel as well. Definitely be in touch with us. As I said at the outset, if you just logged in and missed this, we're going to ask everyone to try and keep themselves muted unless they are asking a question or speaking regarding the program. And again, by all means, keep your cameras on because it's nice to see you, but try and avoid any distractions that might be a distraction for us or the others watching. Today's program was planned but unplanned. We planned it a few weeks ago with the intent to do just kind of an overall view of the security situation in the neighborhood. Thus the title, An Unfriendly Day in the Neighborhood. I hope someone picked up on the Mr. Rogers Association, and always look forward to having these conversations with Elliot Chodoff. Current events change the exact nature of what we're going to speak about, or the primary topics that we're going to speak about, but still security related. There will be an opportunity to ask questions, and we've already gotten so many. Those of you pre-registered, it's wonderful. There's so many questions, and we're going to do our best to get to as many of them as possible and interweave them into the conversation that's going on anyway. But I'm sure more questions will come up. So again, please feel free to use the chat, which I should probably open so I can see. There we go. And we will definitely do our best to get to all of your questions. By all means, if you're following us, please share this. Share it as a recording, share it the Facebook. Although I have to admit, I have not seen it come live on Facebook yet, which is a bit of a distraction, but hopefully we'll get there. Now, let me introduce my friend Elliot Chodoff. It's the first time we did a program like this back last August. It was unplanned in the sense that Elliot stood in for R.E.A. Lightstone, who was then the special advisor to Israel's the United States then ambassador to Israel, David Friedman. And R.E.A. Lightstone had told me the day before, I believe, that he was called to the White House for a special meeting with Jared Kushner. It was actually fascinating rewatching that program. What we were speculating could have been happening then, because none of us guessed that we were going to be thrust with an Abraham Accord peace treaty that would have 2 Gulf Arab states, followed by Sudan and Morocco, and a general warming of relations with some of the other Arab countries. And Elliot was great then, and I know will be will be today. Elliot made Aliyah from New York in 1983. He's an expert on political, diplomatic, and military issues. And mostly what I love, one of the things that I love about Elliot is that he can seamlessly move between the intersection of where those three things fall out. It's a very, very important asset, not to speak linearly, but to actually see how those overlap. Elliot's a major in the Israeli army. He has a 35-year military career here, and continues to do reserve duty based on his seniority and his unique experiences and skill set. He shared with me, and I didn't know this prior to our previous conversation last summer, that about 20 years ago, right, Elliot, you wrote the plan for the defense of Gaza before
Yes.
anyone was even speaking publicly, at least, right, about a unilateral withdrawal from Gaza. And you shared at the time that a superior of yours, I don't know if it was that he took away that from your plan Gaza was indefensible, or had the position that Gaza was militarily indefensible. But we'll look forward to you talking.
Okay.
No, we want to address that. That's important. And
okay.
it's important
just to mention that. Go ahead. Finish. Sorry.
No. Go.
No, just when we finished presenting and approval and all of that, and went to say goodbye to the divisional commander over a cup of coffee, and he was very grateful and thankful. And I said to him, it's not going to work, right? And his answer was, yes, this area is militarily indefensible.
That's profound.
And
that's tremendously profound.
It was. That was the takeaway from June 2002.
Okay, so almost 19. It's 19 years now. And the last bit of two bits of introduction, which are really appropriate. One of which you will see. If you don't know Elliot, you'll see. He's charming and engaging and tremendously knowledgeable. So we're grateful for that. But most importantly, Elliot's living the good life. Elliot lives in a community that he established in the Galilee in northern Israel. He's a husband, father, and grandfather. And if you follow his Facebook, there's rarely a day that he's not got something really fabulous on his barbecue and an appropriate accompanying beverage. So Elliot, I'm really glad, and I know everyone else will be, that you're here and joining us live tonight. Let's just jump in. We really didn't expect that this would be, and even 2 or 3 weeks ago when we were planning, sure, this could have been a possibility, but who knew? So jumping in, can you give kind of a recap over the last couple of weeks? What in your sense were the factors that drew us into this round with Hamas and Islamic Jihad?
Actually, let me start with an introduction that I often give when I lecture either here or in the US. Very often I'm booked months in advance, and people ask, what are you going to speak about? And I tell them, I don't really know. But the good news about talking about the political military situation in Israel and the Middle East is there's always going to be something to talk about. You may not know what it is until you're actually walking up to the podium, but there'll be something. So this kind of fits into that frame as well. We were originally talking about going up to the northern border, dealing with Iran and Hezbollah, and we'll deal a bit with them as well. But then this kind of drops. And what I'd like to do is divide up the causes into a number of different categories, or a hierarchy, if you will. Because first of all, let me start by saying, anybody who's been reading, and I'm sure the people who are with us tonight are tonight, have been following, have been reading news, been reading reports, reading commentaries. So any commentary that attributes what's happening now in Israel to one cause is a charlatan.
Right.
Okay, start with that, and I say that emphatically. Now, I personally am vehemently opposed to the idea of what is known as monocausal explanations. In other words, there's one reason for something happening. I believe that that's a result of lazy and sloppy teachers and college professors who want to have one right answer on the exam, and Why did this happen? Because of this. Now, you don't need to be a political scientist or a political sociologist, or a strategist, and I'm all of the above. Just think about your own personal lives. When you do something, when you go somewhere, the reason you end up doing what you're doing is usually for a variety of reasons that mesh and that overcome a variety of reasons that went against it. And that's true in virtually all decision making. So let's start with the fundamental constant, and that is that Hamas is a radical Islamic terrorist organization sworn to the destruction of Israel and, as an aside, the annihilation of the Jewish people. It is an outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the ideologues of the Muslim Brotherhood of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s, and I say this advisedly, were Nazis. And I don't bandy that term around. I know today in America, it's very common. If you don't like someone, you call them a Nazi. I mean Nazis. And their rhetoric comes from there. So we have a constant to begin with, and that is an organization that rules Gaza and is very, very popular in the West Bank as well, whose existence is built around destroying Israel. That's number one. But they can't do that on a daily basis. They don't have the strength. They attempt to do it in all sorts of ways. They're not stupid. And by the way, a huge mistake that we make in the West is to think that fanatics are also lunatics. It's not true. Fanatics can be extremely rational, extremely calculating, and that's what these guys are. So that's kind of foundational. Next level up on that, another constant is that Iran is a deep material ideological supporter of both Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Now, I want to just spend a moment on that because there's a myth that many of us have heard. I know it as a myth, but most people don't. And that is that the Middle East is divided between Sunnis and Shiites. The Sunnis and the Shiites hate each other. They're at war with each other. They can be played off against each other. But here we have a problem because the Iranians are Shiites and Hamas and Islamic Jihad are Sunni. More important than that, Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the founder of the Islamic Republic of Iran, who was a Shiite, was a disciple of Sayyid Qutb of the Muslim Brotherhood, who was a Sunni. And if you're beginning to see a certain tie-in here, it's not coincidental. However, and there's an important however, Iran supports Hezbollah, our neighbors to the north, as well as Hamas and Islamic Jihad. But it's not the same kind of support. Hezbollah is a Shiite organization that is an outgrowth of the Iranian Revolution, or to put it a different way, people sometimes refer to Hezbollah as an Iranian proxy. It is not a proxy. Hezbollah is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. What that means is that they will be much more careful, the Iranians, about pushing Hezbollah into a dangerous situation than they are in pushing Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Or to put it in very, very simple terms, they will expend Hezbollah, they will waste Hamas. Okay, now, we've had this ongoing conflict with Iran and Hezbollah for a number of years, Hezbollah for decades, Iran openly for the past few years, primarily in Syria, and of course, all sorts of interesting things that are going on in Iran that blow up and burn and that sort of thing that apparently we've had some input on. But essentially think of it this way, if you think of Israel in the center of this, the Iranian Hezbollah Syrian issue is to our northeast. By prompting and prodding Hamas, they have shifted our attention to the southwest 180 degrees in the opposite direction. So to a certain extent, this was predictable on that level, but it was sort of predictable on a grand level. And now we get down to the specifics. The Palestinian Authority was planning to hold elections this month. Abu Mazen, the head of the PA, is in the 15th year of his 4-year term. I'm going to say that again in case anybody missed the arithmetic. He's in this 15th year of a 4-year term. And he's been under tremendous pressure internally, in other words, from within his own organization, people who've been waiting years to sort of move up into the system, and of course from the opposition to hold elections. So he scheduled elections. And about a month or so ago, it became blatantly obvious that Fatah, his faction, was going to lose. Now, there are a whole bunch of reasons for that, and they're details that we don't really. Realizing that he was going to lose, he decided to cancel the elections. Now, he couldn't just get up and say, I'm going to lose, and therefore I'm canceling the elections. He needed an excuse. Now, Israel always provides an excuse. That's not by doing anything, but focused on a real estate dispute. Sorry?
No, fine. You went out for a minute. I just wanted to be sure people knew you were there. We're good.
Okay. So in a Jerusalem neighborhood called, without going into all of the details, this is an ongoing legal dispute that's been in the Israeli courts for decades. And it involves, depending on how you look at it, somewhere between 4 and 6 families. Okay? Now, I mention that because it doesn't really matter for our purposes whether the dispute is legitimate or not legitimate, a good dispute, a bad dispute. 4 to 6 families is not ethnic cleansing. It is not the Zionists are throwing the Arabs out of Jerusalem. But it was very easy to jump onto that and turn it into much more than it was. It coincided with Ramadan and an Israeli police effort to confiscate a huge number of rocks for throwing that had been gathered on the Temple Mount in Al-Aqsa Mosque. Abu Mazen, the head of the PA, used Jerusalem as his excuse for canceling the elections. Now, this is very important because by doing that, he outflanked Hamas as the defender of Jerusalem and the Muslim holy sites. By the way, don't let the facts get in the way of a good argument here. Okay? This is all image, it's all perception. In order to regain their market share, Hamas had to jump in and say, no, we are the true defenders of Jerusalem and of the holy sites. And to make things even more interesting in terms of date coincidences, on Jerusalem Day last week, they fired rockets. Okay? All of these factors added together produced the situation. And from there, it escalated. Now, we've had enough. Hamas decided very early on that they were going to take their position and try to leverage into an even better position, a higher position. And they, in conjunction with the Islamic Jihad, began firing barrages of rockets into southern and central Israel, as far north as Netanya. But their critical claim, and they're doing this with a certain degree of success, and people, I know that there are some people here who've heard me speak about Hezbollah and its rockets. They are flooding the Iron Dome system, not overwhelmingly because they don't have that capability, but enough that the Iron Dome's effectiveness has been somewhat degraded. Okay? Hezbollah, this was a test for Hezbollah, because Hezbollah has the capability of firing far more than Hamas. And the test for them worked. So they've shown a certain level of success. In the meantime, we're beating them to a pulp. But as an organization, they can afford it. And essentially where we stand now at the moment, before we get into the political aspects of it, and I'll end with this, and then Jonathan, we can sort of carry over into other things, is that we have destroyed a huge amount of Hamas and Islamic Jihad's infrastructure, including taking down buildings that served their intelligence, their weapons capability, their technological capability, an entire underground network of tunnels that we referred to as the Metro, because it allowed them to move large forces between different towns and between the towns and our border without coming above ground. Guess what? Surprise, we knew where they were. We did a cute little maneuver the other day, faking a ground offensive in order to draw them out. And it didn't draw out as many as we would have liked, but it essentially did the job, because its primary purpose was to be able to hit them when they're outside the population centers. So the bottom line is, tactically, the Air Force, this pains me as a ground forces officer, but I'll say it anyway, the Air Force is doing a magnificent job, but magnificent is not going to be decisive. We're pretty clearly not going in on a ground offensive, and I say that analytically, not critically. Ground offensives can be extremely costly, but the Air Force is not going to win this, because you can't win it from the air. So it's going to close down sometime at whatever point it does, with Hamas badly beaten up, but not decisively defeated.
So Elliot, let me jump in on a couple of levels. This is, I mean, we can go all night. I know you have something at 10:30, so we do have a stopping point, but you talk about an overall win, and we can't win without using infantry, without using ground forces. I'd like you to address what a victory means in this situation. But before you do, the opposite is, as you said, it's going to be, in lieu of that, there's going to be a ceasefire, another kicking the can down the road. And it doesn't seem, you just said how brilliantly that the Air Force is operating thus far. Fortunately, not lots of collateral damage, even though even our friends are being critical of the lack of proportion nonsense. But Hamas doesn't have a lot of credit to be able to take yet in order to save face and enter a ceasefire, claiming victory on their side. So could you address kind of what does a victory look like for us, and how does a victory or the ability to even enter a ceasefire, if that's a good option, possible?
First of all, victory against an organization like Hamas is extremely difficult, much more difficult than defeating a country. But even the defeat of a country, I want to give a World War II analogy, because it's one that we tend to forget. Most of us grew up in, I can see by pictures at least, in the post-World War II kind of era mindset. Let's remember something that wasn't obvious to us 40 years ago, but it's very obvious to me today. In 1945, Nazi Germany was defeated. Nazism was not.
Great analogy.
Okay. And you can't defeat an ideology.
Right.
You can set it back, you can beat it up, but here we are. We're in a world with Nazis, and of all different types and stripes. For an organization, it's even more difficult, because unless you can track down and kill the entire 3-4 levels of leadership. Okay, remember, end of World War II, Germany, the Nazi leadership was either rounded up and executed, or they fled like rats to South America and places like that, and hid underground with occasional loose networks between them, but no real ability to come back and regain power. An organization, let's look at Al Qaeda for a moment, can be very badly beaten up, its leadership killed. It goes off into the mountains somewhere, licks its wounds, and comes back 10 years later. Taliban, retaking Afghanistan today. Okay, so I don't see a victory on that level. I see a decisive victory in the level that you beat it up so badly that it has to spend years reconstituting itself as an organization, and then even more years rebuilding itself as a military organization. That can't be done from the year. And just to give you an idea, and I imagine you've seen the reports, the guy who is behind a good deal of what's coming out of Gaza is a fine gentleman named Mohammed Def.
Right.
We've tried and missed 7 times. 7. 4 in this operation and 3 times prior, to send him to a better place for all of us. He was severely wounded twice, critically wounded once, but he's still there. We've hit the bunker that he's in now this week and didn't get him. Likewise, other leaders of Hamas. Now, we've gotten a few of them. We've gotten high-ranking officers. We've gotten key technological types and that sort of thing. But until you completely erase an entire layer, and the layer below it, and the layer below that, the organization is flexible. It'll come back. Now, all of this is a question of time. The last operation we had was 7 years ago. It was 2014. So everything we're destroying today took them 7 years to build. Are we rolling this down another 7 years? Possibly. Is 7 years too long, too short?
Yes.
Very difficult questions. And I'll add to that. If going in on the ground gives us an additional 3 or 4 years, but costs us 300 casualties, is it a good trade?
So you're asking very important questions, but militarily, what do you think?
Look, I think that at this point we should not go in on the ground. I think that I think the marginal advantage of going in on the ground at this point is minimized. I think that they will most likely, let me say this, a few days ago, 4 or 5 days ago, they probably would have come out and tried to meet us on the battlefield. That would have been a good thing. At this point, they would probably fold back into the cities, engage us in urban fighting, small-scale urban fighting, which only means high casualties.
Correct.
Within a hostile population that we're not going to engage.
Right. Right.
So that opportunity apparently has sort of phased beyond it itself.
Right, and I wanted to emphasize something that you were saying before. Even if we were to have great success with minimal casualties, or God forbid, you could say casualties that are worth it to take out the top 3 or 4 levels of Hamas, you're still entering a population of 2.5 million people who aren't going to be throwing rose petals on the street. And some of them, of course, would be really happy to be freed from the burden of Hamas on their neck. But as you said correctly before, they've drunk the Kool-Aid. It's their ideology as well. So we're not going to.
I've engaged in many discussions over the years with many people, Israeli and non-Israeli, over the issue of Gaza. I've got some pretty good, what we say in the Army, Gaza hours under my belt. And obviously, those who are not Israeli and who haven't served in the IDF, everybody's entitled to their opinion. But when I speak to Israelis, and by the way, the number of Israelis who answer yes to the following question declines every year. But I ask, have you ever served in Gaza? As a matter of fact, I gave a presentation to a graduate course last week in Bar Ilan, and about Gaza. The day it started, actually, another one of these pre-planned talks that had nothing to do with what actually, what it did. And very interesting discussion going on. And I asked, have any of you served in Gaza? So a couple of the guys raised their hands. I said, no, I think you're misunderstanding my question. Not did you go into Gaza during an operation.
Correct.
Did you ever serve in Gaza?
Correct.
When the divisional command was in Neve Dekalim and the brigade commands were in Gaza proper and so on? They said no. I said, okay, I'm not trying to lord this over you. I just want to tell you that when I asked that question to people who did serve in the 80s and the 90s, up until basically until about 95, when we pulled out of the Palestinian population centers. The next question I asked them is, did you ever have to patrol Jabalia refugee camp? Now, for those who are not familiar, Jabalia is a refugee camp in the outskirts of Gaza City. It is the most densely populated kilometer on the face of the earth. Yes, Elon, you're an exception to the rule. You're an old man. I see your nose. Okay. Elon, did you ever patrol Jabalia?
I
Good question.
did worse than that. I was on the land day in Gaza City, in the center, where there's like hundreds of thousands shouting, while it's like only 30 of us there guarding it. Believe me, the one time in my life that I pee in my pants was on that day.
Okay, so this is just so everybody knows, Elon and I are very good friends. We don't normally admit to it. This was not pre-planned in any way. Elon, do you ever want to go back and patrol there again?
Good.
No, thank you. I will let someone else do that.
Okay, exactly. All right. Anybody who answers yes to that question, I have a list of psychiatrists.
So,
in other words, it was a long way around, but I think an important one. This idea of going into Gaza and trying to control it, this myth that you can control a population, as you say, of 2.5 million hostiles, unless you're willing to behave in a way that we are absolutely correctly unwilling to behave, which is to round up lots of people and shoot them, and we're not going to do that, okay, then there is absolutely no way to control that population. And that's another thing we have to keep in mind as a reality. Okay. So we don't have a lot of really good options. I would have preferred a ground operation 4 or 5 days ago.
My wife sitting in the other room with our son as a paratrooper waiting to do just that is probably relieved hearing having you said that.
But there are no guarantees. The whole thing could change tomorrow morning.
Correct.
But that it looks like that's the direction we're going.
But in order for it to go that direction, we have to have both sides willing to now enter a ceasefire. And Israel, for lack of a really bad phrase, is having a good time. We're successfully carrying out strategic, very tactical operations. Yes, there's some collateral damage, but we're
right.
Tremendous, more so than I can recall in any of these kinds of operations. Maybe I don't know. You're the military guy, but the question now, the opposite is, what will it take for Hamas to be able to somehow save face and claim that they've won? Do they need more money from Qatar? Do they need to hold on to the 2 bodies and 3 living Israelis? Do they need fishing rights opened up? What do they need in order for them to say we win?
So first of all, let me start from our side.
Okay.
Okay. By the way, I don't predict an agreed upon ceasefire.
Uh-huh.
Now, I say that very hesitantly because predicting anything in the Middle East is always a tricky business. But they've climbed up on a very high tree demanding that we withdraw from Sheikh Jarrah and we withdraw from the Temple Mount, and that ain't happening. And they're not going to be able to climb down very easily from that tree. We have our issues, the bodies of our soldiers, the Israelis who are being held by them, and so on, and a few others. They're not going to agree to that so quickly either. So what I see happening is on a much more practical and less agreement level. The first, and I absolutely agree with you, Jonathan, the Air Force is having a field day. It's doing, as I said before, an incredible job, both against fixed targets like buildings and tunnels and their outposts and things like that, and also against dynamic targets like rocket launching teams and anti-tank teams and that sort of thing. And by the way, we should not ignore that there are ground operations going on by special forces units who've been killing a good number of terrorists in tunnels and around tunnels. And it's out there, but it's not being heavily reported. In other words, it's, again, with all proper and due respect to the Air Force, it's not just the Air Force. The artillery is doing a very good job, the tank forces, and as I said, commando and special forces as well. But there is a law of diminishing returns. In other words, over the past week, we've hit hundreds upon hundreds of targets. And with the exception of the individuals like Def, who I mentioned earlier, and a few others, we've basically done the damage to the physical aspects of their infrastructure that we're going to do. Now, can we do more? Of course we can do more. But here's where the diminishing returns comes in. One errant bomb that takes out a school,
right,
or an apartment building filled with families, and we've set ourselves back all the way to the beginning, and then we're forced to stop because the world will come down on us like a ton of bricks.
Correct.
Now, it's hypocrisy, it's politics, but it's a fact. That's what's going to happen.
If it happens. Gotcha.
So, no, I'm saying that's what will happen if. Now, the question becomes, what are we risking that possibility for as time goes on? Because remember, the high-level targets were taken out early, and now we're working our way down the list, and that doesn't mean there's nothing left to hit, but we're getting lower and lower on the list as we go in terms of the priority of the targets. So that's what I mean by diminishing returns. Second, there's a flip side to it. They have tried attacks by land, by sea. They fired anti-tank missiles. They killed a soldier. Now, I hate to say it this way, but I'm a military analyst and an officer. They had the vehicle that the soldier was in had no right to be where it was. But it doesn't matter. If they shoot down a plane, if they manage to get a terrorist attack into Sderot or into a kibbutz, and they kill 20, 30, 40, 50 people. If they hit a school bus, I can give you all the nightmare scenarios, or a hospital. Iron Dome fails, it's not 100%. And instead of hitting a building, and I don't say this lightly, I say this in pure relativity. And instead of killing a person, they kill 30 kids. First of all, they have their victory.
Okay.
And then what do? Kill 30 of their kids to balance it? We're not going to do that. In other words, our target list is the same fixed target list no matter what they succeed in doing along the way. So what I see happening is now, frankly, I think that President Biden made a mistake. because if Netanyahu agrees to de-escalate now, he will look weak.
Good point.
And by the way, whatever their conversation was their business. The mistake was putting it into a White House public statement.
Correct.
Leaders of friendly countries can have free and open conversations all they want. I think that's perfectly legitimate, and even use diplomatic pressure if they want to behind closed doors.
Correct.
Totally legit. The minute you put it into a public statement, President Biden told Netanyahu he expects a de-escalation today leading to a ceasefire. He basically shot himself in the foot. Because here again, let's be serious. We're talking about Israeli politics as well. We're in the middle of a political season, trying to put together a government. I don't buy, absolutely do not buy, that what's going on today was caused by Netanyahu. But anybody who thinks that a politician, any politician, is not going to take his image into account in part of his decision-making, doesn't understand politics, doesn't understand politicians, and doesn't understand how human beings operate.
Correct.
So my guess is that public statement lengthened this by at least 24 hours. But my guess is that sometime over the next couple of days, unless something unusual happens, we're going to start to see it peter out. And the way that's going to happen is that we're going to start striking lower and lower and lower priority targets and tactical ones. In other words, if we see a launch team, we're going to hit them. If we see an anti-tank team, we're going to hit them. But fewer and fewer structural strikes into Gaza. And we're going to see a de-escalation. And then there's going to be a statement that a ceasefire will go into effect at a certain hour. 15 minutes before that, Hamas will unleash 200 rockets. And then they'll say ceasefire, and we'll agree to it. And that's basically how I see it ending. Possibly tomorrow, my guess Friday. But again, in case it's not obvious, I'm very, very hesitant about those sort of predictions.
Well, that's the timing is harder to predict, but it's a great analysis, Elliot, and that's why you're here. I want to just pause and remind people, whereas I'm trying to keep track of all the questions that were posed beforehand, and I'm sure people have questions, please put them in the chat so we can try and interweave them into the conversation, depending on how much actual time we'll have for formal questions at the end. We could keep going on this kind of direction a great deal, Elliot, but I wanted to go back to what the original, for a little bit, the original intention of our conversation was to do an overview. I don't want to skip over Lebanon and Syria. Those are important, but you've addressed that a little bit. We'll come back to it. One of the things that I've been wondering about and strangely enough worried about is the well-being of our neighbor King Abdullah and the Hashemite kingdom, with Hamas exerting tremendous influence as the caretaker or protector of Jerusalem and the holy sites, obviously superseding the Palestinian Authority, but Jordan technically has authority for the Temple Mount. And what was it, month ago, 6 to 8 weeks ago, there was a mini attempted coup by his half brother. He's not in the most easy situation. Where do we need to be looking over to the east from our neighborhood?
Look, Jordan is an interesting anomaly, because the Hashemite kingdom, in other words, the royal family, has been hanging on by the skin of its teeth since the 1940s. They are the most unstable, fragile regime in the neighborhood. But they manage. Now,
Right.
Part of that is because the core of the Jordanian army is thoroughly, absolutely loyal. As a matter of fact, the Arab Legion, which is the core of the Jordanian army, swears its loyalty to the king, not to the state. In other words, it's the royal guard. And for those who don't know, the population of Jordan is divided. Numbers are hard to come by. Let's say 70-30, it might even be 80-20, Palestinian and Bedouin. And there's no love lost between those two ethnic groups. Now, here again, in the West, we think Arabs are Arabs or Arabs are Arabs. Not the case.
No, and we need to underscore that the king is a Bedouin. He's in the minority.
The king is a Bedouin. And early on, his grandfather, his great-grandfather, made pacts with the Bedouin tribes in what was then becoming Jordan. And they swore loyalty to him and to the family, and they made up the core of the Arab Legion, trained and organized by the British. Yes, the Jordanian queen is Palestinian, but the royal family is Bedouin. I think that Abdallah, the current Abdallah, like many of this generation around the Middle East, is trying to create a more sort of a broader base of a country rather than a narrow family sort of arrangement. Saudi Arabia, they're trying to do that as well. His success so far has been marginal because deep ethnic divide, deep ethnic conflict is very, very hard to get out from under. By the way, ethnic conflict is unique in all the different types of conflict: political, religious, ideological, territorial. In ethnic conflict, you can't change sides.
Good point.
Okay. In religious conflict, hey, you know what? Hold a gun to my head. Switch.
Right.
Ideology, likewise. Ethnic, it doesn't work that way. So, again, an unstable government, a fragile government, but with a very, very hard core. And here, let me just give you an example. There hasn't been a recent recurrence of this, but if we go back 50 years to September 1970, when the Palestinians, the PLO under Arafat, tried to overthrow King Hussein, and he finally unleashed the Legion, and it's a whole story in and of itself. I won't go into the background to it, but he finally unleashed them in September 1970. Depending on whose numbers you believe, they killed up to 30,000 Palestinians in 3 weeks. And the Palestinians refer to that month as Black September. So they haven't forgotten. They're going to poke here and poke there. And you mentioned the whatever it was, coup, threat. I think the regime is extremely sensitive. I don't know the background to it, and I don't believe anything I read on it. Because remember, in any royal situation, we know this from Europe as well, brothers and cousins and uncles and that sort of thing are always a threat. It's always a good thing to pick them up and throw them in prison at the slightest, provocation. So I don't know if it was real. I don't know if the guy was having a conversation with someone who's an informant. I don't know.
Okay. But what does King Abdullah do now in order to strengthen his authority, both vis-a-vis Jerusalem, because that's really one of the only things that gives him any credibility, and within his own country?
With Jerusalem, he opens his mouth, which he has, and he threatens us, which he has, and nobody takes him seriously. In his country, he uses the power that he has to make sure that any opposition to him is caught, rounded up, and gotten out of the way as quickly as possible, just like his father did.
Does Hamas matter to him? Hamas doing what it's doing now?
Look, Hamas doesn't matter on an ideological level. Let me get this to focus. There we go. It doesn't matter on an ideological level. It matters on an organizing level because it has influence. But I think he's got a pretty good grip. Jordan is not a free country.
Okay. Okay. Let's move to our northern neighbors. You spoke to them about them a little while ago, and I love the explanation that that Hezbollah is the franchise wasn't the word you used.
Wholly owned subsidiary.
Wholly owned subsidiary of the of Iran.
Right.
Iran pulls the strings.
Yes.
I mean, Syria is not quite as controlled. It's a bit of a mess. But from when we initiated this plan, it would have been a much different conversation then as it is now about Iran and its influence on our northern borders. But where do you see that going? They've held back. It's not worth it yet. You made a very good point that they're watching as far as the ability to overcome the Iron Dome. By the way, a few people asked about our capabilities with the Iron Domes. Do we have enough of the units? Do we have enough of the rockets? And where in Lebanon they have much more significant rockets and a higher quantity. So where does that all play in? They're sitting? They're not just watching as spectators.
Okay.
They're planning the next game.
Well, they're certainly watching as more than spectators. However, they made a mistake in 2006. Now, we all remember the war with Hezbollah in 2006. What was the act that precipitated that conflict?
It was the attack on the patrol on the northern border, our patrol. No?
That was the ultimate catalyst. But what precipitated it was the taking of Gilad Shalit in Gaza.
Ah, okay. Okay.
Okay, we forget. But Gilad Shalit was taken. We began an operation in Gaza to go after him.
Good point.
And then Hezbollah jumped in the north. And they made a mistake. They thought they could get into the game, play it a little bit, and what I'm about to say may sound contradictory, but this is the Middle East, so contradictory and complementary mean the same thing. On the one hand, they were going to help Hamas by taking some of the pressure off of them, and they were going to compete with Hamas by grabbing more soldiers in a more spectacular way than Hamas did Shalit. And it blew up in their faces because Israel said, you know what? No, it doesn't work that way. We're coming after you. Now let's leave for a moment whether we did a great job or a poor job or that sort of thing. We beat them up really badly. And Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah after that war, said in a TV interview, he was very open about it. He said, if I had known that was going to be the Israeli response, I would not have ordered the operation. Okay, so now here we are 15 years later, and the same Nasrallah is sitting in Beirut, and he's not going to make the same mistake twice.
Right.
So that's one. Two, we've worked out, I'm going to see if I can do this really quickly. We operate on two different levels with Hezbollah. Level number one is to make sure that they and the Iranians together don't develop the capability to try to take us on the level of wiping us out. In other words, winning against us. Winning in the classic, the World War II sense. sense, of rolling into Tel Aviv, much as they would dearly love to do that. They're not at that point. They're not anywhere near that point, and we keep operating to make sure they don't get to that point. Hezbollah and Iran behind it is not going to waste its capabilities that it's building up for that day simply for the feel good of firing some rockets into Israel. Okay, that would be a waste. And that's why I said earlier, Iran might expend Hezbollah, but it's not going to waste Hezbollah.
Okay.
Which is why the rockets that were fired today, I will guarantee you, were not fired by Hezbollah. For those who don't know, 4 rockets were fired out of Lebanon at northern Israel. So I'll tell you 2 reasons how I know that they weren't Hezbollah, aside from what I know of Hezbollah. One is that 2 of them fell into the water. Hezbollah's aim is much better than that. And 2, Hezbollah is not going to instigate an operation with 4 rockets. They'll do it with 400 rockets, but not 4.
Good point.
Okay. So more likely, and this is now speculation based on a good deal of long research on Hezbollah and experience, they knew those rockets were going to be fired. They might even have tacitly approved the rockets being fired, but it wasn't by them. It was probably by some Palestinian faction out of a refugee camp that were permitted by looking the other way to set up somewhere in the south and fire and disappear. And Hezbollah knows very well that we're tracking them close enough that we know it wasn't them, which is why we fired some desultory rounds back in the direction of wherever it came in, and both sides called it quits. So what we're looking at in the north in general is a very fraught, tense, but stable ceasefire situation until the day that they decide that they can win.
So what will be that? What's the catalyst for that on their calculation?
Okay, it could be Iranian nuclear capability. It could be a sufficient Iranian buildup in Syria. I will tell you for sure, one of the things that they're looking at is how does America respond?
Right.
Okay. And right now, I'll be honest, the American response has been mixed. I'll say more positive than negative. I'm talking about what's going on in the last week. More positive than negative. Let's be, I'm not going to do American politics here, just American policy. Okay. No comparisons. America has defended Israel in the Security Council. It vetoed a condemnation in the Security Council. In other words, it's giving us that breathing space. It's continuing to supply weapons, which was not the case in 2014 under the Obama administration. Okay, in other words, do not take for granted the resupply of weapons. It didn't always happen. By the way, it didn't happen under Reagan. It didn't happen under Bush. I'm an equal opportunity critic here. This is not this side versus that side. Okay. So the Biden administration in general has been, how can I put this? Good. Not superb, good. We're beginning to see a shift. I think some of it is under pressure from the left wing of the party. He had the meeting today with Rashida Tlaib, and he was very effusive in his praise for her. In other words, there's a lot of internal politicking going on there as well. And the Iranians are watching. Will the Americans come up short? And that, here again, I want to be clear because I've been reading all sorts of stuff. The new administration is not the cause of what's going on. It's a background and it's being tested. And America's willingness and readiness to be involved and back Israel is one of the factors that go into whether or not our enemies start a war with us. I'm going to go into some ancient history for a minute to give you an idea of how crazy it can be. One of the reasons the Russians instigated the Egyptians into moving into Sinai in 1967, which led to the Six-Day War. And for those who aren't familiar with the background, it's way beyond what I can go into here. But the Russians instigated the Egyptians to move into Sinai, into what would become the Six-Day War, because the Russians knew for a fact that America was bogged down in Vietnam and could not operate in the Middle East. Okay, in other words, the chess game can be that crazy. So they're watching the American response. They're watching the European response, which is also mixed. We have 3 foreign ministers coming tomorrow, the German, the Czech, and the Slovakian, in solidarity. The Austrians are flying the Israeli flag over their parliament.
Correct.
So there's a huge mixed bag of what's going on out there, and they're watching that very closely. And they'll continue to poke it.
Right.
They'll continue to poke it. They're also using the propaganda. You know, Israel's killing children and drinking. What did Erdogan say? We kill their children and we drink their blood, and only then are we satisfied. Okay, but the American State Department called him an anti-Semite.
Great points.
Okay, so that's why I say that there's a lot going on here that's not unequivocal.
Right. I like your analogy from 1967 and being bogged down physically in Vietnam, because one can also make the case without a special advisor for Israel and the Middle East, without an ambassador to Israel, that one can say that there's a mental bogging down,
a blind spot,
right. Blind spot, and the Iranians can be looking for that. So these are all great things that everyone should take away from this conversation. First and foremost, we hope the current violence will stop. So Jill, you just asked the question about resupplying. There's a couple of questions I want to wrap in. Okay. Elliot, you just said that the U.S. has been resupplying weapons. And there is a general question about, actually it was a question somebody asked before the briefing about how many Iron Domes we have, and for some of the rockets that the Lebanese have, that Hezbollah has, the Iron Dome isn't the proper weapon, I think, anyway. It's one of our mid-range, similar systems, but the mid-range ones. But to what point, and Susan Warner asked the question here about whether or not we should be producing our own weapons. So question, I don't know the answer. The Iron Dome is an Israeli developed system. I assume we're manufacturing that here. Are we also manufacturing the missiles that we launch?
Okay, so first of all, very excellent question. Let's keep a few things in mind. Israeli technology is world-class. I don't want to say the best, it's world-class. There are things that we do better than anybody else, which is why countries like America work with us. For those who don't know, the largest private employer in Israel is Intel. Okay, they're not here because they're Zionists. I mean, they might become Zionists over time, but that's not why they showed up here. Okay, and Microsoft and Google and all those guys. Elbit systems are used all through America, in aircraft and technology and that sort of thing. So Israel has the tech. What we don't have, the best way to relate it is an anecdote, true story, 1971-ish. Richard Nixon and Golda Meir are sitting together. They had a great relationship, a great rapport. And he turns to her just out of the blue and says, Madam Premier, if you could have 3 wishes, anything you could wish for from America, what would you ask for? And she didn't bat an eyelash. She turned to her and said, I would take 3 of your generals. And he says, our generals? Your generals are the best in the world. Which of ours could you possibly want? She said, General Motors, General Dynamics, and General Electric. Okay, those are the generals that we don't have. Now, we produce our own tank, the Merkava, which is arguably the best tank in the world. But let's keep in mind that one of the things, the realities of a tank, as big and bulky and all of that it is, as it is, unless you get wiped out on the battlefield, you recover many of your losses. We do not produce our own aircraft because when an aircraft gets shot down, it's lost.
Right.
And one of the reasons, and here again, it's a story in and of itself, I don't want to go into it. One of the reasons the Lavi project was canceled
For those
is because
who don't know,
Israel
that was-
aircraft,
Go ahead.
it was an Israeli homemade F-16 class fighter that was superior. But Israel Aircraft Industries today, Israel Aerospace, didn't have the production capability that the Air Force needed. And basically, the Air Force said, look, in the first 4 hours of the Yom Kippur War, we lost 52 aircraft. And IAI said, well, we can produce 4 a month. And the Israeli Air Force said, that's nice. Hello, General Dynamics. Okay, so that's something that you need to keep in mind. Now, missiles, if we're talking about these kind of missiles, not large, intercontinental, we do have the industrial capability to produce. Right. And here I'll tell you 2 things. One is the problem with the Iron Dome, no matter what, is going to be that there's simply a limit to how many targets it can engage. It's a large number, but Hezbollah has a huge arsenal and a huge launch capability. So that's a problem. But now I'll tell you a side story, and I'm going to have to wrap this up shortly. In 2014, we ran out of Hellfire missiles that we were firing from our helicopters, American missiles. Guided missiles, we were using them, by the way, militarily improperly because they're extremely, extremely accurate, but they are anti-tank, anti-armor missiles. We were using them against fixed targets because of their precision. In other words, so as to minimize civilian casualties. I hate the term collateral damage. And we used them up. And we were supposed to get automatic resupply, and Obama personally refused to approve it. Actually, he actually stepped in and disapproved the resupply, which meant paradoxically that we had to use less accurate missiles, endangering the population. Great. But now here's a PS. We had an absolutely superior anti-tank missile that in Hebrew is called the Gil, in English it's called the Spike, that was designed for its handheld and vehicle mounted. And the Israel industry that produces it never produced an air version because we were getting the Hellfire from the United States. And when they cut us off in 2014, the government and the defense ministry went to them and said, can you produce a helicopter and an aircraft version? They said, sure, no problem. And they did. The air version of the Spike has a range of between 30 and 50% longer than the Hellfire. So now the US military is buying the Spike to replace the Hellfire in their arsenal. Don't mess with Israel.
Great. Elliot, because you have a limited, we're gonna end the program shortly anyway, and we're gonna invite David Nearing to come on board to close us out in a minute. One more question. We call this the Inspiration from Zion program. We're always looking, and you, by the way, I don't have to underscore it. There's no one who's watching who says, despite the tension that we're going through, your analysis is great and indeed inspiring. So thank you for that. But before David closes us out in prayer, where do you see God fitting into all of this? You individually and us as a nation.
Look, first of all, I don't believe in miracles. I believe we are a miracle. This whole operation is a direct expression of God's promise, the promise that was made in Genesis, that was reiterated in Deuteronomy, and constantly referred back to through all the prophets.
Right.
So if you ask me, and I've spoken to many Jewish and Christian audiences, we know how this ends. And we win. My concern always, and it's one that I'm always concerned with professionally, is minimizing the cost between now and then.
Right.
And that's how I see it. And I think that's what God has put in our hands.
Great. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. David, Elliot, thank you. I want to invite David Nearing to join. Elliot, feel free to stay on or go as you need. We're just going to wrap up. Go ahead.
Let me just, at least a few of the people who are tonight are coming to the meeting that I'll be starting. So
be late.
At 10:30, we're going to kick in for those who are moving over with me.
Okay, very good. We'll be finished by then. But thank you, really, Elliot. This is great. David, let us know if you're online. We're inviting our friend David Nearing to close us out in prayer and to take an offering, and then I'm going to come back with some very quick announcements about some things coming up that you're all going to want to know about. Just waiting for David. Are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
You're great.
Okay, great. First of all, thank you for the honor of being able to close out this meeting. And I wanted to express a lot of appreciation for the work that Genesis 123 is doing and integrating our communities across the Big Pond, and really trying to explore those things that really go deep into our roots and create the common sap that flows through all of us. And so these opportunities to really understand what's going on in each other's neighborhood is crucial in helping us actually be effective in being there for one another, for a change, historically speaking. So, this is a delightful thing and a blessed thing. I also want to invite everyone to really prayerfully consider a donation to Genesis 123, particularly right now. This is a time of real fear, for people in Israel. It's a time of stress, honestly, for all of us. But right now, the rockets are landing in your yards. And in Genesis 123 gives an opportunity for people to donate and express in a material way their support, in support for the social welfare for the soldiers there. Sort of an attaboy, attagirl kind of support. For trauma relief for Israeli families. And one of the most important thing for people under pressure is the idea that they're not forgotten, that they're remembered and they're cared for. For civilian security, that's for a very practical, hey, we're under threat and we want to help you there. And for, of course, emergency medicine, that when people are hurt and bleeding, they need some practicality. So please really consider a donation to Genesis 123. You can do it through their website. And they give an email there as well. And I'm sure that you also can respond to the email that Jonathan provided as part of this invite. So with that, let's please go to the Lord. Lord, we thank you so much that you're doing this historical work of our communities coming together. We see that it is under fire and under stress that we actually can become bonded. And we stand with our brothers and sisters in Israel as they face a vicious and uncivil, barbaric, cynical assault on their homes, their families, their communities. That's also indirectly targeting the families of Palestinians as they just haphazardly throw killing weapons towards Israel. And if it drops on Palestinians, they show no concern. It's just an opportunity to blame Israelis. Lord, you know the heart of the Israelis. You know their intention. You know their integrity. And then you know their faithfulness to you. And we see that as well. So we thank you for the honor and the opportunity to stand with them. We pray that you would hold up their arms, that you would lift their heads, that you'd lift their hearts, and that you'd create joy and laughter in the midst of pain and fear. and that they would know that we stand with them, that we send our love with them, that our support is with them, and that we stand together in the midst of all this heartache. So Lord, please move our hearts to be supportive of the work Genesis 123 does, as well as supporting Israel in general and this initiative to stand together, Christians and Jews, globally speaking. We thank you for all of this in thy precious and holy name, Lord. Amen.
Thank you, David. It's beautiful. For anyone who wants to do that donation, we do have an emergency campaign that David alluded to, and you can go to our website, genesis123.co. Just two announcements that things, first of all, this is an emergency campaign. We're going to do things that are tactical and impactful, and we're very grateful for people entrusting us with your generous donations to be able to make that happen. And you'll be getting updates as to what we are able to do and when we're doing it, and some of it will be live. We have an ongoing campaign. This week is a tremendous historical anniversary. This week coming up, it's the 30th anniversary of Operation Solomon, the tremendous miraculous airlift of almost 15,000 Ethiopian Jews from Ethiopia to Israel in one weekend. And there's still a lot of Ethiopian Jews who remain in Ethiopia, and the population here in Israel has blossomed to over about 160,000 people, but there are a lot of needs. So we've stepped up this year to create a special campaign to support that, the rescue and restoration of Ethiopian Jews in Israel. And over and above any emergency campaign, we're hosting webinars on this. We're inviting people to donate, to partner with us. And I encourage you to also be in touch with me about that. And finally, next week, a week from tonight at exactly the same time, tonight Israel time, exactly the same time, we're hosting another webinar. I don't know where we're going to be in terms of the situation with our neighbors, but we are hosting a webinar with Rabbi Yehuda Glick, who is a candidate for president here in Israel. And those of you who don't know that we have a president, much less what the role of the presidency is, Yehuda Glick is dynamic. He also is a tremendous bridge builder between Jews and Christians. And we're gonna have a great personal dialogue about him, his life, his vision for Israel, and his chances. It's a very different electoral system for president, and I'm not going to get into that now. You'll have to join us next week. Everyone on this broadcast will receive the Zoom link, which we generally hand out very stingily, both because of Zoom limitations, but also I don't like it when people come in and interrupt our programs as hackers. So please book the time, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Western. I know we have our good friend Bishop Uma in Tanzania right now. We're about an hour or two apart, but at the same time, a week from tonight, Wednesday the 26th, please plan on joining us. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for understanding that this is important and being part. I hope that this was the inspiration that we aspire to, and it was packed with knowledge and information that will open your eyes to the situation and as how things unfold the coming days and weeks. Thank you all. God bless you, and we will send out the link to this, which unfortunately was not on Facebook or YouTube, but will be, and invite you to share that. God bless you all. Thank you.